All right, folks. This definitely is the last 100 meters of the marathon. How are you supposed to react? Thank you very much. We want to begin on page 244. And we're going to study the rest of this chapter. And I'm going to make some remarks about the last chapter, which is short. It's only like about 4 pages. So let's begin at where it says the expression "at that time." Let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll explain what that time means. Father in heaven, we come to our last session here of this seminar of Anchor. We thank you because we've felt your presence as we've studied your word. We know that momentous times await us, but we know that we have nothing to fear because you are the God who sits on the throne. Nothing escapes your attention. You have perfect knowledge of how to maneuver to deliver your people. Amen. We ask that you will bless our study together. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So let's review where it says the summary of Ellen White's comments on Daniel 12, 1 and 2. Page 613, the standing up of Michael. Page 616, the time of trouble. Page 635, God's people delivered. Page 637, the special resurrection. However, Daniel 12, verse 1 begins with a time reference. Very important time reference. Let's notice what that time reference says. It says there, "At that time shall Michael stand up." So the question is, at what time? Does there have to be some connection with the previous context? At that time? Yes, which time? So let's go to the bottom. It's at the bottom of the page on my study notes. However, we cannot understand Daniel 12, 1 and 2 isolated from its immediately previous context, because Daniel 12, verse 1 is a continuation of the events at the end of chapter 11. We know because of the expression, "at that time." We know this, of course, for that reason. This temporal expression, "at that time," links Daniel 12, verses 1 and 2, with what occurred previously in verses 40 to 45, particularly verses 44 and 45. Are you understanding this point? Crucially important to know that the expression "at this time" in Daniel 12, verse 1 harks back to the previous chapter, particularly verses 44 and 45, as we shall see. The crucial question at this point is this: where would we expect to find Ellen White's comments about the events that will occur before Daniel 12, 1 and 2? The answer is unmistakable. We must find them in the pages that immediately precede the chapter on the standing up of Michael. Not rocket science. It's obvious. So let's take a look at the literary structure of Daniel 11, verse 44b, in other words, the last half of the verse, verse 44b, through verse 45, and Daniel 12, verse 1. Let us carefully consider the literary structure of verses 44b, the second part of the verse, through verse 45, to determine how they relate to Daniel 12, 1 and 2. The purpose is to ascertain the event to which the expression "at that time" points. A careful comparison of verses 44b and 45 with Daniel 12, verse 1 reveals that they describe the same events in the same order, but with different terminology and emphasis. In other words, 12:1 is parallel to 11, 44b, and 45. Let's notice how this works out. Daniel 11, 44b through 45 has these 3 elements, A, B, and C. The first element is the king of the north goes out to destroy and annihilate many. That's 11:44b, the second half of the verse. We're going to go back to the first half of the verse later on. But what I want you to see is the king of the north goes out to destroy and annihilate many. Then B, the king of the north sets up the tents of his palace in a strategic place between the seas and the glorious holy mountain, which is Zion, Jerusalem, with the intention of giving a final blow to the remnant that have found refuge in there. And then C, at the moment when the attack is going to take place, the king of the north will come to his end with none to help him. Is the sequence clear? Okay, first, goes out to destroy and annihilate many. Second, sets up his tents in a place, strategic location, to deliver a death blow to those who are on Mount Zion in Jerusalem. And three, when he's about to do that, he comes to an end with none to help him. Let me ask you, who is the focus of these 3 points? The king of the north, right? Would you agree that the king of the north is the focus? Yeah. He goes out to destroy. He sets up his tent. He comes to his end. So the focus is on the king of the north. Now, Daniel 12, verse 1 is going to have the focus on the remnant who are in jeopardy. Notice, A, Michael stands up to defend his people. When he goes out with anger to destroy many, Michael stands up to defend his people. And what comes as a result for God's people? A time of trouble such as never was comes for God's people. Because the king of the north is going to try and destroy them. Michael is defending them. And then what does God do? Letter C. At the end of the time of trouble, God delivers them from the king of the north. Who is the focus in the last 3 parts? The focus is God's people. A, Michael defends his people. B, his people go through a terrible time of trouble. C, God delivers his people from the king of the north. Are you following me or not? So the focus of 11:44b and 45 is on what the king of the north does. Whereas Daniel 12, verse 1, the focus is what God does for his people. So let's continue. Daniel 11:44b through 45 and 12:1 are precisely parallel, but they portray a different emphasis. Whereas Daniel 11:44b and 45 highlights the activities of the king of the north and its destiny for oppressing God's people, Daniel 12, verse 1 focuses on the jeopardy of God's people at the hand of the king of the north and their deliverance by God. Now, here's how it works. Daniel 11:44b with 12:1a. When the king of the north goes out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many, Michael will stand up to protect them. Are you following me or not? 45a with 12:1b, when the king of the north places the tents of his palace in a strategic location to deliver a final death blow against God's remnant, they will experience a terrible time of trouble such as never was. And then the letter C, 11:45b through 12:1c, however, the king of the north will come to his end with none to help him when God intervenes to deliver his people who are written in the book. Are you catching the gist of it? Interesting. So is Daniel 11:44b and 45 connected with 12:1? Yes. The previous passages deal with the king of the north. Jeopardy for God's people. The second set is God intervening to deliver his people. Now, you say, but wait a minute. You didn't say anything about 11:44a, the first part of verse 44. So let's pursue that. What about Daniel 11:44a, the first half of verse 44? The text tells us, listen carefully now, that tidings from the north and from the east will trouble the king of the north. tidings from the north and the east will trouble the king of the north. And what will he do as a result of being troubled? You know, some versions translate shall alarm the king of the north. Shall shake up the king of the north. There's news from the north and from the east that's shaking up the king of the north, the papacy. What is it? What are the kings of the north and from the east? Well, very clearly, the anger of the king of the north is because of the tidings. Because it says there in verse 44, it says, but tidings out of the north and the east, out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore, he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many. What does the king of the north do when the news from the north and the east troubles him? The news infuriates him. And he goes out to destroy God's people. Now you say, what is this news from the north and from the east that shakes up the king of the north and fills him with rage against God's people? We need to remember that the book of Revelation is an expansion of Daniel. Revelation adds to Daniel what is not necessarily in Daniel. Let me read you these two statements from Ellen White. The books of Daniel and Revelation are one. One is a prophecy, the other a revelation. One book is sealed, that's Daniel. The other is a book opened. That's the devotional book, Christ Triumphant, page 344. And in Testimonies to Ministers 115, we find this. The book of Daniel is unsealed in the revelation to John and carries us forward to the last scenes of this earth's history. So in order to know what the tidings from the north and from the east are, we have to go to the expansion in Revelation. So let's go to Revelation chapter 7. Revelation chapter 7. And let's notice something that happens here from the east. It says there, and then we'll go back to our study notes. And I saw another angel ascending from the west. Okay, good, you're still with me. And I saw another angel ascending from the east, having what? The seal of the living God. And he cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea. Don't hurt any of these until my servants are what? Until my servants are sealed on their foreheads. So where does the sealing come from? What direction of the compass does the sealing come from? The seal comes from the east, right? And it's placed on the servants of God. This whole scene comes from Ezekiel chapter 9, where it says that the seal is placed on the forehead of those who sigh and cry because of the abominations that are being committed on the earth. So who is it that's going to be sealed? Those who sigh and cry because of the abominations that are being committed on the earth. By the way, does a harlot have abominations in her cup? We studied that, right? So let's go back to our study notes now that we've read the verse. Revelation 7 verse 2 describes an angel who ascends from the east with the seal of the living God. This angel places the seal on the foreheads of those who sigh and cry. By the way, what is the sighing and crying? It's the loud cry of Revelation chapter 18. That's what it is. In contrast, the land beast of Revelation 13, 11 to 18 will impose what? The mark of the beast on the unfaithful and sentence them to death. Those who do not sigh and cry, or those who sigh and cry. Thus, the work of the sealing angel from the east will enrage the wicked who have the mark of the beast. So what are the tidings from the east? It is the sealing message, the sealing of God's people. Now, Revelation 18 verses 1 to 5. vividly describes the powerful loud cry angel who descends from heaven. Is the whole earth filled with his glory? Yes. Those are the tidings from the north. You know, we usually think of the north in a linear fashion. North is that way, south is that way, east is that way, and west is that way. But in the Bible, the north is up. The north is heaven. Where did Lucifer aspire to set up his kingdom? Isaiah 14 said, I will ascend to heaven in the sides of the north. So the north is up. The south is down, the underworld. And by the way, the negative sides are the west and the south. It has to do with the position of the sun. God is a God of light, and light begins in the east. It reaches its highest intensity in the north. And darkness begins in the west, and it reaches its deepest intensity in the underworld. So the sealing is from the east, and the loud cry of Revelation 18, 1 through 5, is actually the message that comes from heaven that decries the sins of Babylon and calls God's people to what? To come out of Babylon. And of course, Babylon is going to be very happy that they're losing their people. Do you think that the papacy and apostate Protestantism are going to be furious over the sealing message? Are they going to be furious when people are leaving Babylon and joining God's remnant people? That is the news that alarms or angers the king of the north. It's connected with the news from the north and from the east. Ellen White concurs with this biblical view. The title, listen carefully now, the title of the chapter that immediately precedes the standing up of Michael and the time of trouble has the title, The Final Warning, the loud cry, the sealing, the message from heaven. Actually, she begins that chapter on the final message. It's the chapter immediately before Michael stands up. We find on page 603, the title of the chapter, The Final Warning. Do you know how she begins that chapter? By quoting Revelation 18, verse 1, verse 2, verse 4, and verse 5. The loud cry. She begins the chapter with that. And then on page 605, just 2 pages later, notice what she wrote. She speaks about the seal of God and the mark of the beast. While the observance of the false Sabbath in compliance with the law of the state, contrary to the fourth commandment, will be an avowal of allegiance to a power that is in opposition to God, the keeping of the true Sabbath in obedience to God's law is an evidence of loyalty to the Creator. While one class, by accepting the sign of submission to earthly powers, received the mark of the beast, the other, choosing the token of allegiance to divine authority, received the seal of God. So let me ask you, is Revelation chapter 7, verse 2 being referred to in this chapter, the final warning? Yes. She begins by quoting the loud cry verses of Revelation 18. Now, what does this sealing message cause among the wicked? Page 607. The power attending the message will only madden those who oppose it. What happens with the king of the north when news from the east and from the north comes? He's filled with what? With rage because of the message, the news that is coming from the east and the north, which is the sealing message and the loud cry message. Are you with me? Ellen White follows the same sequence. So does Ellen White have anything to say about Daniel 11, 40 to 45? Oh, you better believe that she does. But she doesn't use the language. Now, in the next chapter, Ellen White flashes back to events that led up to the time of trouble. Notice pages 614 and 615. She says, the power attending the last warning. What is the last warning? The loud cry and the sealing. Where does the sealing come from? From the east. And where does a loud cry come from? From heaven, from the north. That's what troubles the king of the north. So it says, the power attending the last warning has enraged the wicked. Their anger is kindled against all who have received the message. She's talking about the loud cry. And Satan will excite to still greater intensity the spirit of hatred and persecution. So let me ask you, is the loud cry and the sealing message going to anger the king of the north? Ellen White says so. But she's actually referring to Daniel 11, the same sequence. In short, the news from the north is identified in Revelation 18, 1 through 5 as the latter rain and the loud cry of the angel who descends from heaven, that is from the north. And the news from the east is the message concerning the seal of God. Thus, Daniel 11:44a describes the message from the north and from the east that enrages the king of the north to the point of wanting to destroy God's remnant, as described in 11:44b. Isn't it fun to do detective work? I find it fascinating. I love to struggle with the text and find where Ellen White is in harmony with the Bible. She always comes out with shining colors. She's always right, if you study carefully. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, but Pastor Bohr, okay, we understand verse 44 and verse 45, the news from the east and the north, the sealing message and the loud cry from heaven, going to anger the king of the north, and therefore he's going to go out and set the tents of his palace in a strategic location to destroy those who are in spiritual Jerusalem, but he's going to come to his end with none to help him. But does Ellen White have anything to say about verse 40, 41, 42, and 43? What would be the starting point of Daniel 11, 40 to 45? Let's pursue that. In this paper, we have focused primarily on the events from Daniel 11:44 to Daniel 12, verse 2. However, if we continued moving backwards, before that, in the Great Controversy, before page 603, which is the final warning, we would find in reverse order that Ellen White expounded upon each phrase of Daniel 11:40 to 45, ending, going backwards, with a chapter on the French Revolution, where she describes the deadly wound of Daniel 11:40, the first part of the verse. Remarkably, although she does not employ the terminology of verses 40 to 45, the sequence of events clearly reveals that she is discussing them. Now, let's go to Daniel 11. Once again, Daniel 11, and let's read verse 40. It says here, after speaking, by the way, verses 30 to 39 are describing the first stage of the papacy. Remember? It's the times dividing of time. But now notice verse 40. And at the time of the end, when is the time of the end? 1798. What's going to happen at that time? Shall the king of the south push at him? Push at the king of the north. What does that mean, push at him? We'll come back to that in a moment. And the king of the north shall come against him, that is against the king of the south, like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. What overflows? Rivers. Is the king of the north going to be a raging river? According to this? Yes. So at what point at the time of the end did the king of the south, France, push at the king of the north? It was at the time of the French Revolution, the conclusion of the French Revolution. So let's follow through here. In this paper, we have focused primarily on the events from Daniel 11:44 to Daniel 12:2. However, if we continued working backwards in the Great Controversy before page 603, we would find in reverse order that Ellen White expounded on each phrase of Daniel 11:40 to 45, ending with the chapter on the Bible and the French Revolution, where she describes the deadly wound of Daniel 11:48. Did the king of the south attack the king of the north at the time of the end, 1798? That's talking about the deadly wound. Remarkably, although she does not employ the terminology of verses 40 to 45, the sequence of events clearly reveals that she is discussing them. Daniel 11:40, the first part of the verse, tells us that the king of the south would push at the king of the north at the time of the end. Ellen White clearly identifies the beginning of the time of the end as 1798, when France dealt the papacy its deadly wound. So France is pushing at the papacy and attacking the papacy and giving it its deadly wound. Ellen White states, Great Controversy 356, but since 1798, the book of Daniel has been unsealed. Now, how do you know that 1798 there is the time of the end? Because she actually is referring to the little book of Daniel 12, verse 4, where it says, the book is sealed until the time of the end. But in the time of the end, it's opened. Are you following me or not? So the time of the end begins when the little book of Daniel is opened. So it says, since 1798, the book of Daniel has been unsealed. Knowledge of the prophecies has increased. She puts Daniel 12, verse 4 there. And many have proclaimed the solemn message of the judgment near. Now, the word push does not adequately capture the nuance of the Hebrew word. The historical event that this word describes is not a friendly nudge or shove. The NIV translates, will engage him in battle. The ESV, English Standard Version, translates, shall attack him. The word is used elsewhere to describe an animal goring with its horns. Is this a violent attack? Yes. You better believe it is. That is, in the year 1798, the power described as the king of the south gored or attacked the king of the north. This proves that 1798 is the starting point of Daniel 11:40. Are you with me or not? The beginning point, actually, of Daniel 11:40 through 12, verse 2. Now, here's the question. We know who the king of the north is, right? Yes. Who is the king of the south? Well, let's pursue this. There is a wide consensus among students of Bible prophecy in the Seventh-day Adventist Church that the king of the north symbolizes the papacy. Furthermore, until recent times, there was a broad consensus that the king of the south represents secularism that grew out of the French Revolution. However, times have changed, and some Adventist preachers, as they look at current events, are reinterpreting the king of the south as a symbol of militant Islam. Now, literally and geographically speaking, the king of the south was what? Egypt, geographically. Because Egypt was the kingdom geographically south of Israel. You can read that in Daniel 11:5 and 8. It says Egypt is the king of the south, literally. But here we're dealing with symbols. However, in eschatology, we are not dealing with literal geographical locations, but rather with global systems. And Lewis Weir expressed the principle clearly. This is what he wrote. When passing over into the Christian era, there is an automatic transition from literal to spiritual Babylon, from literal to spiritual Jerusalem, from literal lands of Israel and Babylon to their spiritual antitypes. Who was the king of the south in 1798, symbolically speaking? Revelation 11 clearly identifies France as spiritual Egypt. You can read it in Revelation 11, verse 8. It says, which figuratively is called Sodom, and Egypt, referring to France. Thus, while Babylon, the king of the north, represents global apostate religious system, Egypt symbolizes the secular powers of the world that threw off the yoke of papal Rome, beginning with France. Revelation 17 explains that for a very short while at the end, the secular powers of the world will once again join together in unholy wedlock with the harlot, as they did with the papacy during the 1260 years. But in the end, the kings of the earth, as did France, will what? Will hate the Babylonian harlot and destroy her. So is the fulfillment at the end a global fulfillment? Absolutely. Now, in biblical times, Babylon was the literal king of the north. So who was the king of the south? Egypt. Is France called Egypt in Revelation 11? Spiritually, Sodom and Egypt. So we know that Egypt represents the movement that arose in France, secularism, atheism. In other words, that which has no religious inclination. In biblical times, Babylon, on the other hand, was the literal king of the north, because it was the literal enemy that would come from the literal north against literal Israel. However, today the king of the north is a global spiritual system. Would you agree with that? Well, if the king of the north is a global religious system, must the king of the south also be global? Duh. So in biblical times, Babylon was the literal king of the north because it was a literal enemy that came from the literal north against literal Israel. However, today the king of the north is a global spiritual system of counterfeit religion, the Roman Catholic papacy. Isn't she called Babylon, the harlot, in Revelation chapter 17? Of course. The Roman Catholic papacy is certainly not literally north of literal Israel. It is actually west. The Roman papacy then is the fulfillment of the king of the north, which is Babylon. Now, what was the main characteristic of France in 1798? The spirit of the French Revolution was atheism. But actually, Daniel 11:40, the first part of the verse, involves far more than a denial of God's existence. The genius, in quotation marks, of the revolution, culminating in the captivity of Pope Pius VI, was to secularize the government and separate it from its adulterous relationship with the church. Is that true? That the French Revolution severed the relationship between the church and the state? Yes. In the course of several decades after the French Revolution, country after country in Europe established secular governments separate from the dominance of the papacy. In 1862, Cardinal Henry Edward Manning, we've read this before, let's read it quickly again, a convert from the Anglican Church to the Roman Catholic Church, complained about how the secular governments of Europe had forsaken the papacy. This is what he wrote. See this Catholic Church, this Church of God, feeble and weak, rejected even by the very nations called Catholic. There is Catholic France and Catholic Germany and Catholic Italy, giving up this exploded figment of the temporal power of the Vicar of Jesus Christ. They're rejecting the idea that the Pope is the Vicar of Christ on earth. He continues, and so, because the church seems weak, and the Vicar of the Son of God is renewing the passion of his Master upon the earth because he's being rejected, therefore we are scandalized. Therefore we turn our faces from him. Things got even worse when Emperor Victor Emmanuel II confiscated the papal states. We talked about this. And united Italy in 1870. And the popes, in protest, declared themselves captives of the Vatican, and until 1929, they remained there. However, let me ask you, are the civil powers that took away power from the papacy, that rose against it, France, the secular power of France, are the nations of the world going to restore power to the papacy once more? Yes. In fact, Ellen White expressed it this way. Great Controversy, 564. Let the restraints, the what? The restraints now imposed. So the restraints are voluntary, right? No. The restraints now imposed by whom? Secular governments, which is the fruit of the French Revolution. And Rome be what? Reinstated in her former power. And there would speedily be a what? Revival of her tyranny and persecution. Is that what Ellen White said in the statements that we read at the beginning of our study? It's exactly what we said. Where does Turkey fit with this? Nowhere. It's a distraction. It has you look in a different place for the fulfillment of prophecy. East instead of west. Now, let's deal with the flow in Daniel 11 and the Great Controversy. Let's compare the flow of Daniel 11 with the Great Controversy. Both Daniel 11:40 through 12:2 and the Great Controversy provide the identical sequence of events. Daniel 11:40a, Great Controversy 265 to 288. France attacks the papacy. That's the Bible in the French Revolution is the title of the chapter. France attacked the papacy and inflicted the deadly wound, thus severing the illicit love relationship between the church and the state. The secular powers removed the civil sword from the papacy. Then Daniel 11:40, the second half of the verse, through verse 43, is a description of the events that transpired between the infliction of the deadly wound in 1798 and the beginning of the tidings from the east and from the north. And we don't have time to get into all the details, but you can read those verses and then go to the Great Controversy to find where Ellen White is commenting about those things. Then Daniel 11:44a, the faithful remnant will proclaim the call to come out of Babylon, tidings from the north, and the sealing message, tidings from the east. This is the loud cry empowered by the latter rain. By the way, the name of the chapter is The Final Warning, very appropriately named. Then Daniel 11:44b and Daniel 12 verse 12:1a, we find the sealing message and call out of Babylon will do what with the wicked? Will enrage the wicked. And what will Michael do? Michael will stand up to protect those who are written in the book from the rage and the wrath of this king of the north. Then Daniel 11:45a and Daniel 12 verse 1b, a universal death decree will be written against the remnant, and the king of the north will set up his tents outside spiritual Jerusalem, intent on delivering a final death blow. This will bring about for God's people what? A time of trouble, such as never has been seen. Then Daniel 11:45b and Daniel chapter 12, verse 1c, the third part of the verse, the king of the north will come to his end with none to help because his base will turn against him. Michael will deliver his remnant. Amen. Are you following me or not? Yes. And then, by the way, Ellen White is giving these pages exactly the way it transpired. 265 to 288, 289 to 605, 605, 607, 613 to 635, 635 and following. Then on page 637, she actually quotes Daniel 12 verse 2. When the king of the north comes to his end with none to help and he falls, Daniel 12 verse 2 says that those who died in the faith of the third angel's message will rise in a special resurrection along with those who pierced Jesus. Did Ellen White have anything to say about Daniel 11:40 to 45? You better believe she did. But she doesn't use the terminology. She doesn't quote the verses. Now, if we have a few minutes left, we're going to deal with how can we discover what Ellen White says about something when she doesn't quote the verses and when she doesn't even refer to the terminology. Now, let's go to our final section quickly here. It is uncanny how Ellen White vividly describes the events of Daniel 11:40-45 without ever quoting the verses or alluding to the language. The question is, why did she not simply come out and quote the verses and then comment on them like she does in other places? There's a clear historical reason. The original view of the pioneers was that the King of the North represents the Roman Catholic papacy. This is a clear view expressed in a pamphlet, A Word to the Little Flock Scattered Abroad, co-authored by James and Ellen White in 1847. However, in the early 1870s, Uriah Smith, who was the highly respected editor of the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald, changed the view of the pioneers, reinterpreting the King of the North as Turkey. Because Turkey was prominent in the news of the day, Smith changed the traditional view to fit current events. James White was not pleased with Smith's new view and accused him of removing one of the landmarks of the Advent movement. Things started getting testy, and members began taking sides. By the way, you can read the whole story of this in a little book that was written by Lewis Weir. I think it's called Mrs. Ellen G. White and the King of the North. We have it available in our store. She continues, or I continue. Things started getting testy and members began taking sides. In this context, Ellen White instructed her husband to desist of his criticism. And some people have said, see, Ellen White knew that her husband was wrong. Undoubtedly, she knew that an understanding of Daniel 11:40-45 was not an urgent matter at that time. Her main concern was to preserve the unity of the church. If Ellen White had quoted the verses of Daniel 11:40-45 and offered a view contradictory to Uriah Smith's, she would have been accused of nepotism. So she expounded upon these events without quoting them or alluding to the language, knowing full well that someday someone would discover her view of the matter. Significantly, in the eschatological portion, that is the part of Great Controversy that has to do with end time events, Ellen White does not mention Islam even once as playing any role in the fulfillment of Bible prophecy at the end. It appears that Ellen White saw no prophetic significance to the rise of radical Islam. The same is true of the great chain prophecies of Scripture. There's no reference to Islam in the prophecies of Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 8, and 9, Revelation 12, Revelation 13, Matthew 24, and Revelation chapter 17. Neither is there any reference to Islam in the series of the churches and the seals. Ellen White's silence on the role of Islam in Bible prophecy has puzzled some Seventh-day Adventist scholars who have concluded that Ellen White simply did not have all the light on end-time events. At least one of these scholars some time ago reached the conclusion that Ellen White was wrong in her interpretation of the little horn as a symbol of the papacy, and I can mention who that was, Samuel Bacchiocchi. At the end of his life, he believed that the little horn was Islam. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that Islam might not play a role in the precipitation of end-time events, as Ellen White describes them in The Great Controversy. It is true that Islam might serve as the catalyst for the fulfillment of the prophecies concerning the United States and the papacy, but I do not believe that prophecy contemplates the rising power of militant Islam directly. Now let's stop there, and I want to make a few remarks about the next chapter, and we'll see how far we can get in the next. Did you understand what we studied so far? Yes. All right, good. Now, a few thoughts about Ellen White's view of the 7 plagues. Here we're going to see how to detect what Ellen White has to say about certain segments of Scripture when she doesn't quote the verses and she doesn't use the language. Ellen White had much to say in The Great Controversy about Daniel and Revelation. However, there are some portions of these books that she never quoted, such as the supernatural darkness of the 5th plague and the drying up of the Euphrates, the battle of Armageddon, and the kings from the east of the sixth. Ellen White never quoted any verses on the fifth plague, on the drying up of the Euphrates, on the battle of Armageddon, or the kings that come from the east. So she appears to be silent on the fifth and sixth plagues. Is it just possible that she had much to say about these verses, although she never quoted them? Let's consider the last three plagues of Revelation 16 as an example of how to find Ellen White's commentary on verses that she never quoted. Now, bear with me. In Great Controversy 628, Ellen White used less than 1 page to describe the first 4 plagues. That's Revelation 16, 1 through 9. So she used less than 1 page for the first 4 plagues of Revelation 16. So she quotes in half a page verses from the first 4 plagues, but in the next 7 pages, she doesn't appear to say anything about the last 3. In fact, after page 628, she never quoted any verse from the 5th or 6th plagues in the rest of the book. Are you understanding what's happening here? This has led some to wonder whether Ellen White had any light on the supernatural darkness of the 5th plague, the drying up of the Euphrates, the battle of Armageddon, and the kings that come from the east in the 6th plague. It is important to note, however, that Ellen White, now here's the key, that Ellen White did quote verses that describe the 7th plague. Interesting. In Great Controversy, pages 636 and 637, she quotes verses from the 7th plague. Thus, she quoted from the first 4 on page 628 and the 7th on pages 636 and 637, but is silent on number 5 and 6. No verses. Is it possible she had nothing to say about number 5 and 6? No. Let's summarize. Quotes from the first 4 plagues, page 628. No quotations for the 5th and 6th plagues, Great Controversy 629 to 635. Quotations on the 7th plague, Great Controversy 636 and 637. On the surface, it would appear that Ellen White had nothing to say in the Great Controversy about the 5th and 6th plagues, because she does not quote any verses. However, appearances can be deceiving. If Ellen White did, listen carefully, if Ellen White did offer any commentary on the 5th and 6th plagues, where would we expect to find it? Where would we look for her remarks on the plague of darkness, the drying up of the Euphrates, the battle of Armageddon, and the kings that come from the east? The answer to this question is obvious. If she quotes verses from the first 4 plagues on page 628, and on the 7th plague on pages 636 and 637, we would expect to find her comments on the 5th and 6th plagues somewhere in between. Are you with me? The key to understand Ellen White's perspective of the 5th and 6th plagues is in Great Controversy 635, where she describes the wicked multitudes of Babylon, which are the swirling waters of what? We've studied this, of the symbolic Euphrates upon which the harlot sits, preparing to execute the death decree. As the flooding waters are about to slay God's people, the darkness of the 5th plague falls upon Babylon. Here's how Ellen White described the events leading up to the 5th plague of darkness. With shouts of triumph, jeering and imprecation, throngs of evil men, these are the waters of the Euphrates, by the way. She doesn't quote the verse, are about to what? What is it, the rushes? Water. Are about to rush upon their prey. When lo, a dense blackness, this is a 5th plague. A dense blackness, deeper than the darkness of the night, falls upon the earth. Now, what about the 6th plague? We're not going to read from Isaiah 17, 12, and 13, where it says that waters are the enemies of God's people that want to drown them, that want to kill them. We've dealt with that before. Now, what happens when the darkness falls upon the earth. Ellen White wrote in Great Controversy 635, the angry multitudes, what are the multitudes? The waters. The angry multitudes are suddenly arrested. What is that? The drying up of the waters. Their mocking cries die away. The objects of their murderous rage are forgotten. So does Ellen White have anything to say about plague number 6? Yes. How about plague number 5? Yes. Never quotes the verses. But the darkness followed by the drying up of the waters shows that she's discussing plague number 5 and plague number 6. Now, in the scenario that Ellen White portrays, after the darkness of the 5th plague and the drying up of the waters of the 6th, by the way, have you ever read in the 6th plague, it says that the plague was poured on the great river Euphrates to prepare the way for the kings from the east? I suppose that's the Chinese. No. Ellen White on pages 640 and 641, after she's described the supernatural darkness of the 5th plague, the drying up of the waters, they wanted to drown God's people, she says, soon there appears in the east a small black cloud, about the half size of a man's hand. Jesus rides forth as a mighty conqueror, faithful and true. In righteousness he doth judge and make war. And the armies which were in heaven follow him with anthems of celestial melody. The holy angels, a vast unnumbered throng, attend him on his way. Are these the kings that come from the east? Absolutely. Did Ellen White have anything to say about plague number 5, 6, and 7? Yes, because she actually quotes verses from the 7th plague. But she appears to be silent on number 5 and number 6. But she isn't. She's just not using the terminology. Is that also true of Daniel 11? It's the same principle. By the way, it's the same principle of 24 elders. I won't pursue that because we don't have the time. I think I mentioned it before. Revelation speaks of 24 elders. It speaks about 4 living creatures. It speaks of lamb as though he had been slain. It's using symbols. But Ellen White, in the last pages of Desire of Ages, she says that the 24 elders are the representatives of the worlds that never sins. She identifies them. She never quotes the verses. But she says they're the inhabitants of other worlds. She says that the 4 living creatures are cherubim and seraphim. And then she says the lamb as though it had been slain is Jesus that appears before the Father. She's interpreting the symbols, but she's not quoting the verses. So what do we need to do when we study the writings of Ellen White? And she doesn't appear to have anything to say about certain verses. Don't give up. Don't say, well, someday we will know. Ellen White didn't have all the light. That's what some people are saying. Ellen White did have the light. But we have to search the writings of Ellen White just like we search the scriptures. Were you able to follow this? I would have wished to have more to say, but I think that you catch the principle. That Ellen White is in perfect harmony with the Bible. The only thing is, she expands upon the Bible. So we have to go beyond Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Revelation 13, Revelation 12, Revelation 13, Revelation 17, and Daniel 11. We have to go to the great controversy for the final and fullest expansion of the historical method of interpreting Bible prophecy. I trust that our study together has been fruitful and that now you will return with zeal to share what you have learned here, because we need to not keep it, but we need to share it. God bless you all, and don't miss the next exciting anchor next year.